The American accent is older than the British accent. The Brits are the ones that changed their accent. Isn't that shocking? Most of us believe that, well, since the American colonies were established by the British, that the British were the ones that had the original accent of the British language, and that perhaps the Americans, the Canadians, the North Americans anyway, that somehow they changed their accents from the British, that we know. The Queen's English, the way people talk in the north of England, Liverpool, Yorkshire, Scotland. Well, I wouldn't know about Scotland, but anyway. Even the Scots and the Irish had their own accents. But they used to have their own language. British was not their main language, not their mother tongue. But anyway, we may be shocked to find that the original English accent is spoken by the North Americans and not the British. The American accent is older than the British accent. This is by Ruben Westmus. It is on Curiosity. We were discussing this the other day with some people, and I was shocked to hear this, and that's why I think you should know of this, because we don't know of this. The first English people to colonize a new land that would become the United States came over in 1607, and they brought the English language and the English accent with them. But if you're picturing a bunch of pilgrims talking like Benedict Cumberbatch, only to have their descendants talk like Keanu Reeves, then we've got news for you. They say the modern American accent is a lot closer to how English used to be spoken than the British accent is. First of all, the Americans speak using the R, whereas the English drop the R. The main difference between the British accent and the American is the rhoticity, or how the language pronounces its R's. What you might think of as a standard American or newscaster voice is a rhotic accent, which basically means R is enunciated, while the non-rhotic, stereotypical English accent drops the R, pronouncing in words like butter or corgi. Of course, there are a few American accents that drop the R too, like the Bostonians, packing the car in Havald, yard, for example, or a waitress in the south who calls you sugar, and some accents in Northern English, England and Ireland and Scotland retain their R's as well, especially the ro of the Scots. Now, the Americans did not find a treasure trove of R's in their new country. Instead, the British speakers willingly lost theirs. They wanted to lose the R in theirs around the time of the Industrial Revolution. Many formerly lower-class British people began to find themselves with a great deal of money, but a voice that instantly marked them as a commoner. In order to distinguish themselves from their lowlier roots, the new class of Brits developed their own posh way of speaking, and eventually it caught on throughout the whole country. It's called received pronunciation, and it even influenced the speech patterns of many other English dialects. The Cockney accent, for example, is just as non-rhotic, but a lot less hoity-toity. The missing R's in the United States. Meanwhile, the English speakers in the States, for the most part, did not get the memo that the R's were out. Although pronunciation has changed on both sides of the Atlantic, some Americans began claiming that their particular regional dialect is actually the original English pronunciation, preserved for all time in the remote pocket of the country. Unfortunately, most of these claims don't really pan out. One popular candidate is the Appalachian accent, which is distinguished by some archaic words such as afeared, but otherwise doesn't seem to have much connection to the language of Shakespeare. And on Virginia's Tangiers Island, people speak a strange form of English difficult for even Americans to understand, which claim to be the original accent. But linguist David Shores believes the idiosyncratic speech is a result of isolation instead. But on the topic of English speakers making a conscious choice to drop their R's, the British that is, there was an interesting blip in linguistic history around the time that radio became popular. Like received pronunciation, the mid-Atlantic or transatlantic accent was deliberately invented to serve a purpose. You almost certainly don't know anybody who speaks it, but you've definitely heard it before. It's the voice of Cary Grant, Katharine Hepburn, and Vincent Price. The R's are dropped, the T's are articulated, the vowels all softened to an erudite drawl. It's also an ambiguous combination of the British and American accents. Taken together, all of the factors made it the perfect voice for broadcasting at the time. The unique pronunciation was easy to understand, even on early audio equipment with poor bass frequencies, and could appeal to listeners in multiple English-speaking countries. But it fell out of favor after World War II, and one of the first accents to be immortalized on audio recording was consigned to another piece of wartime nostalgia. The English-American split is just one chapter in the rockingly saga of English language. With his characteristic wit and warmth, Bill Bryson tells a story of one of the world's weirdest languages and mother tongue, English, and how it got that way. And so our English is more like the Shakespearean English. Think, in contrast to have stuck around the US, think path rather than path. At first glance, these colonial legacies of pronunciation seem especially apparent in certain remote areas of the US, hence the argument that some places in the US have preserved Shakespearean English. Now, linguist David Shores notes that these claims are exaggerated, but the islands of, for example, Tangiers in Virginia, that has an unusual dialect and can be unintelligible even to Americans, and rather than any freezing of the Elizabethan speech patterns, is responsible for its linguistic quirks. Another U.S. area linked to the 17th century British English Appalachia, especially the mountain ranges of Northern Carolina, linguistic Michael Montgomery wrote that North Carolina Tourist Division used to issue a booklet called A Dictionary of the Queen's English, which claimed that the English of Queen Elizabeth I could be found in pockets of that state, of Virginia. Montgomery traced the idea back to an educator clergyman who around the turn of the 19th century spread the idea that mountain language was a remnant of a much older tradition of English. This myth helped to counteract negative impressions of oft maligned mountain people. And turning this around, claiming kinship with a Shakespearean way of speaking, was a way of bringing status and apparent classiness to a marginalized part of the country. Quote, mountain speech has more archaisms than other types of American English, but that's about it, Montgomery writes. These include terms like afeared, which famously appears in The Tempest. Overall, however, the Shakespeare myth reflects simplistic, popular views about the static nature of traditional folk cultures, especially those in out-of-the-way places. Common phrases. It's a bit surprising Shakespearean English came to be associated with high status in education. That's the other oft-forgotten complication of the concept. Even if Americans do speak more like the Elizabethan English than today's Brits themselves, it doesn't mean they're speaking the posher version of the language. Quote, we've always had this stigma in the UK that Shakespeare has to be posh, but in his time it was everyday speech. This is what David Barrett says, who conducted workshops in Shakespearean original pronunciation while preparing a thesis on the subject at the University of South Wales. He also transcribed Christopher Marlowe's poem Hero and Lender into the original pronunciation. There have been similar projects for the King James Bible and the Lord's Prayer. Even Queen Elizabeth I did not pronounce words in a particularly posh way. Barrett has researched Elizabeth's letters for clues to her pronunciation. Since spelling at the time were far from standardized, written texts are one tool linguists use to determine how words would have been pronounced historically. The Queen's habits likely included pronouncing servant as sarvant, or together as together, Gither, Gither. These were pronunciation styles of ordinary people of the 17th century, rather than the nobility. So, like Shakespeare, the Queen had a down-to-earth manner of speaking, in contrast to the upper-crust accents she's portrayed with in contemporary films and TV programs that we've seen of her. Now, it's worthy noting that today's Elizabeth Queen II is speaking in a more common way than she once did as well. Quote, "The reason I find the Elizabethan period interesting is that the pronunciation contains many sounds which are far enough removed from modern English to create a challenge for the speaker, but there is also a considerable overlap with modern English," says Barrett. So when actors and audiences hear original pronunciation for the first time, it's a bit of a shock to the system. Quote, "Every English speaker who hears original pronunciation for the first time hears something different in it," Barrett says. Sometimes that sounds similar to Northern Irish or West Country accents, other times South African or even American. Star-Spangled Shakespeare? American actors have a head start with performing the original pronunciation. It's so much more American than the prestigious received pronunciation that we hear the Brits speaking today, in which Shakespeare plays are generally performed today, says Paul Meir, theater professor emeritus at Kansas State University and a dialect coach who's working on theater productions like original pronunciation version of A Midsummer Night's Dream. For instance, Americans are already used to pronouncing fire as fire rather than faya, as most Brits do. It's useful to know how words would have been pronounced centuries ago because it changes our appreciation of the texts. Because British English pronunciations have changed so much since the era of Queen Elizabeth I, we've rather lost touch with what early modern English would have sounded like at the time. Some of the puns and rhyme schemes of Shakespeare's day no longer work in contemporary British English. Love and prove is just one pair of examples. In the 1600s, the latter would have sounded more like the former. The great vowel shift that ended soon after Shakespeare's time is one reason that English spellings and pronunciations can be so inconsistent now. So what's popularly believed to be the classic British English accent is not actually classic at all. In fact, the British accents have undergone more change in the last few centuries than American accents have, partly because London and its orbit of influence, Queen's English and the nobility as opposed to the commoners, was historically at the forefront of the linguistic change in English. They wanted to show that they were different, and they had to change their language to do that, to sound posh, to separate themselves from the lower classes. Now, as a result, although there are plenty of variations, modern American pronunciation is generally more akin to at least the 18th century British kind than modern British pronunciation today. Shakespearean English, this isn't, but the English of Samuel Johnson and Daniel Defoe were getting a bit warmer. Dialect coach Meyer understands the appeal of the idea that 17th century speech patterns have been perfectly preserved an ocean away, that is, in America, It's a delightful, attractive myth that Shakespeare's language got fossilized in parts of the US, he says. But as sociolinguist Brooke explains, quote, every actively spoken dialect is always changing. That's as true as the rural ones as the urban ones. This is what echoes of older dialects can be heard here and there in different places. But unfortunately, there's no living museum of Shakespeare in English. If you'd like to join me on my Patreon account, you will hear content not covered by mainstream media. These riveting stories will be based on my research, and I will state my opinions and give my personal insight on diverse and controversial subjects and world events not covered by mainstream media, and not supported by YouTube guidelines. So whatever I have on my Patreon, most of those will not be on my YouTube channel. Please consider becoming a member today. More of the most significant and important videos will be on my Patreon channel. Your support helps me to continue my research and keeps this YouTube channel alive. And we depend on your support, your generous charity, because we help economically challenged families here in Athens, Greece, in Kapota, and we also help the young generation with university tuition and the community around our church. Thank you.